You don't need to know someone's lived experience if they can't afford to pay their mortgage so they're living in a car. You know their lived experience. Their lived experience is that they can't afford a home and they're living in a car. Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. The NDP convention kicked off today in Hamilton, Ontario.
And unlike the Conservative convention, dozens of people showed up in attendance.
Yeah, dozens. Instead of the thousands that showed up to the Conservative convention in Quebec City.
Anyway, the angry NDP lady Kim Wright is back. So let's grab a drink or four and get right into this one.
Listen, I want to begin our discussion with the policies that were debated this afternoon. I think that's probably a good place to start because very much it had to do with affordability. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, how do the policies debated and adopted this afternoon differentiate this party from the Liberals, considering that Liberals, too, are trying to go after the progressive vote? I'll begin with you, Kim.
So one of the things that's so important as we're having these policy discussions is really understanding people's lived experiences. It isn't just an academic discussion. These are people's lived experience, how to get housing, what they're dealing with at the grocery stores. And I know that there are some who will say, oh, it's just New Democrats going after the big CEOs. It's so much more than that. If we're actually going to tackle these big issues about how to make sure we have a livability situation in Canada, that's what we need to start talking about. And that's where the New Democrats are at their best, and when we're talking about real issues that face real people.
Oh, I hate that word, like that term, lived experience. It drives me nuts.
It's so cringy. It's nails on a chalkboard. What are you talking about? You don't need to know someone's lived experience if they're going to a food bank. You don't need to know someone's lived experience if they can't afford to pay their mortgage so they're living in a car. You know their lived experience. Their lived experience is that they can't afford a home and they're living in a car for Jesus.
Yeah, it's just like a buzzword that they use to try to quote unquote connect with people, but I personally think that it's really demeaning.
Oh, of course. And what it also means is it dilutes truth. You know, you hear people say, my truth. No. It's the truth. There isn't my truth and your truth. It's the truth.
There's my experience and my anecdote, but the truth is the truth.
Now, don't get me wrong. If someone, says, hey, I've had a really hard time and I've had to go and live in a car and everything. Yeah, I'm going to give you empathy. Absolutely. But I'm not going to refer to that as, well, that's your lived experience. No. Let's get this feeling garbage out of the way and deal with the issues, deal with the facts, and fix them.
And stop demeaning people.
James, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say, from a research point of view, we see in focus groups and in polling time and again, housing. It is one of the preeminent issues that people are facing across the country. The resolution on building more affordable housing, I think, speaks to that outside of this room. I think New Democrats have been all gas, no brakes on the housing issue, pushing the Liberals to go as far as they can. But I also think the motions on the CEO pay and wealth taxes differentiates New Democrats from the Liberals and Conservatives in many ways because they're willing to go there and talk about those inequities in our society. A lot of people are feeling pinched. Life is harder and more expensive, and I think some of these resolutions speak to those pain points that Canadians are feeling outside of this room.
The other thing that drives me nuts is these commentators, and especially Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau, they're the rich people. Like, they're the 5%, or in JT and Singh's case, they're the 1% in this country. Like, they're the top income earners. So they act like they're, part of the common people. These are the rich guys.
Well, and the other term that I really hate, because it's a really scary term that most people don't clue in on, because it's so close to the other actual proper term that we should be using, is inequity. It's very close to inequality. And that's what people are kind of relating it to. And it's completely different. For those that may not know the difference, and if you do, I apologize if you feel patronized, but I want to make sure we're crystal clear. So equality is two people go to a job interview and they are provided the same opportunity to interview for that job. Okay? And equality of opportunity is just that. And then the person who interviews better is more qualified for the job, ends up getting the job. And that could be a man and a woman, a man and a man, a woman and a woman, regardless of what you look like. Equity is different. It's a lot different. Equity is equality of outcome, meaning you have a predefined outcome that you want to set. So these two people go into that interview again, man and a woman. They both interview. Let's say the man is better qualified, but the company has a quota to fill because they employ diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they need to up their numbers for the amount of women. So they choose to hire the woman over the man, despite the fact that the man's more qualified. That's equity. That's equality of outcome, because there's a predefined outcome that you're trying to hit. So when they're saying, well, we need to go after the CEOs and we need to go after the rich people because there's inequity in our society. Yes, there's inequity in our society. There's inequity in every society. You know the society that there isn't inequity in, or at least in theory? Communism.
Well, and we all know how that plays out, don't we?
And this is why they're using inequity. This is communism in a box. So when you hear equity, that's a problem.
Well, as you say that, I'm thinking about the grocery store worker who went to the microphone, talked about how she herself cannot actually afford the groceries that they sell at the store. But you know, the policy proposals debated and adopted this afternoon, and in fact throughout this whole weekend, none of it has to be adopted by party leadership or members of parliament. So I'm wondering, how closely do you think leadership needs to pay attention to these policy proposals? Do they actually have to adopt them as part of an election platform?
Well, in large part, it does become part of our platform deliberations. You saw Jagmeet Singh at the microphone talking about some of these resolutions. You'll see caucus members as part of the debate. And I was in Quebec City with you a couple of weeks ago for the Conservative Convention. You don't have that same sort of engagement, that same sort of transparent opportunity to listen to the feedback, to have that dialogue that we're seeing here on the floor this weekend.
But do you think the leadership needs to follow it more closely?
I think you need to give leaders flexibility, but what you're hearing is very much in these resolutions and these discussions a broader understanding about what do these policies mean, not just for people who are policy wonks, but that lived experience on the ground, and that's what we're going to continue to see out of the New Democrats.
You don't have transparency into it, Kim, because you're not part of the Conservative Party.
Right. And the difference is they have to be a lot more careful as to what policies they look at adopting into party leadership within the Conservatives. Why? Because they actually have a shot, a really good shot, if you look at the polls, of forming government. And the NDP does not.
Well, and that's it. So let's just say, for example, and this is just an example I'm making up off the top of my head. This is not actually happening, so don't freak out. But say a bunch of people at the Conservative Convention said, okay, nobody's allowed to talk about anything left-wing. We're taking away freedom of speech. You can only talk about right-wing stuff. That would never make it into government. Number one, that goes against the charter. But number two, that's going to be extremely unpopular with the vast majority of Canadians, even the ones that aren't left-leaning. So why would you adopt a policy that's going to alienate you from your voter base?
Nodding yes to that.
Yeah, no, I you know, the story of the grocery store worker who can't afford groceries from the job that they work at, the MPs, the leadership, they hear those stories. They get an earful in between conventions as well, too. They're very in tune with the membership, the policies, and while they don't have to directly follow everyone to the letter of the law, they are getting a lot of feedback at conventions that really help guide their strategic thinking going into the next campaign. I have no doubt that a housing policy of some nature will be a highlight of an NDP platform or promises in the next election, whenever that happens.
Yeah, except that I will say, you know, as I was listening to those policy proposals and the debates happening around it, certainly what was expressed here on the floor is further left than what we're hearing expressed by members of Parliament for the most part in the Hill. So does that mean that the party, in order to stave off, Liberals going for that progressive vote, have to be more left-leaning than they actually are right now?
It's always about what can make people's lives better. So some of these conversations, we heard this in the housing discussion. It's great to talk about affordability, but we
she talks down to everyone.
Oh, for sure. And she obviously has no idea about something called, building codes. What are you talking about making buildings accessible? Accessibility is already built in to the building codes.
I mean, maybe if you've got like 100-year-old building in an older part of the city or something like that, but...
Yeah, if you're retrofitting, that's fine. But when you're talking a high-rise tower, when you're talking condos, accessibility is built into that. That's just how they do it. Why would they not? Yes, it costs a little bit more money, but if you don't include that, then you're excluding potential customers. And when it comes to houses, that's a different ball game. You can't, what are you going to do? You're going to make every single house that you build fully accessible, wheelchair access, everything like that. No, that doesn't make any sense at all. And this is the whole problem with the left. They want to transform all of society to accommodate a fraction of the population. And that's not how you run society.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it would be not practical for you to say, just as an example, build a wheelchair ramp for every single new home that's built. Instead, you should do something like looking at grants or tax breaks or something like that for people who do need to have a ramp built.
Right, and remember, it's not just the ramp. If it's a 2-story house, you will need an elevator. You will need a stair climber. You'll need that as well if you're going to mandate this everywhere. Or you disallow 2-story buildings and it's bungalows only, no basements. This is what we're talking about, folks. This is what we're talking about. Remember equity? Yeah, this is it.
Well, and again, when Pierre says common sense, these are the sorts of things that he's talking about. Is it common sense, again, using the same example, to build a wheelchair ramp for every single new home that's built? No, because odds are most people are not going to need it. But what might make sense, as I said, was creating tax breaks or incentives for people who do need them.
Right. So you don't transform society to accommodate a fraction of the population. What you do is you examine the needs of that population and you try to address that specifically as an exception.
What do you say, James? Because, I will say part of the reason why people vote Liberal is because they see a more middle ground. Will this party necessarily run more left based on what we're hearing today?
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of the parties reflect some of the conversations that are happening with the Canadian public, and issues like inequality of income, unaffordability, housing, these things are kind of in the NDP's playhouse, but because there's a bigger focus on it outside of convention, it almost looks like they're aligning more. But there is a strong bit of solidarity between blue-collar workers, middle-class, lower-class workers. They're all feeling it, and I think that some of these policies and the comments that people are making reflect that Canadian sentiment back at the parties. So if they're pushing them to the left, it's because from outside of this building, Canadians are feeling that focus on those issues as well, too.
You're losing the blue-collar people. And why is that? Because the blue-collar people are looking at you because all Jagmeet says is, I can force this government to do whatever I want. Yet he's not forcing them to fix housing.
No, instead he's propping up this Liberal government, which is causing all these problems. Think back to 8 years ago under Stephen Harper, people were not starving and needing to go to food banks in the numbers that they were now. People were not homeless in the numbers that they were now. And Jagmeet Singh is the only person who can call an election at this point in time, and he refuses to do it. Instead, he goes to Twitter and complains about what the government's doing, but still continues to prop them up.
Yeah, he acts like he's a party that's in the official opposition. Never mind that he's basically in a coalition government without being in a coalition government. That's where he is. That's where he is. So for him to sit there and say that, oh, well, I'm fighting for you. Blue-collar workers are saying, no, you're effing not.
Well, in Hamilton, especially, number one, it's primarily NDP. And number two, there's a lot of working-class citizens living there. So that would be like their ideal riding, which I think is probably why they're having the convention in Hamilton. So for them to continue to prop up this Liberal government that is causing so much misery, especially among the working class, and then to be in Hamilton and telling people, oh, you know, we're here for you, we're going to help you, it's a slap in the face.